So I just received the Architecture Competitions Yearbook, and I've been flipping through, and the work in here is so diverse and so interesting, and I really like the small little presentation pages that they also have. And so I'm thinking it would be nice if I did a video showing you how you could do pages like that, focusing on the composition, the style, and basically just recreating some of these amazing pages but with your own work. So I've just been looking through the Architecture Competition Yearbook, and I feel like really inspired to kind of do one of these presentation pages of my own. I think the work in here is so kind of like diverse, and there's a range of different things. So this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. I think it'd be nice to unpack how to put something like this together without it feeling too overcrowded and not with the same like style. So I think that's what I'm gonna attempt, and hopefully it should turn out pretty well. So these are the pages that I'm talking about. They're really kind of like jam-packed, but I think they work well because they all have a very unique style to each one, and they've got a good kind of like hierarchy of information as well, which is really important. And I'm constantly telling students who are putting together their portfolios, for example, that yes, of course you need as much as like images and drawings and renders and stuff on the page, but it's also nice to kind of have a variety and kind of make sure that you're thinking about the composition, where the text is placed, if there's any like sequence of diagrams and stuff. So I'm going to be attempting to kind of like recreate one of these myself using my own work, and then hopefully that can give you also like some tips on how to kind of present your work in a very structured way so that it feels easy to read, it feels pleasing to the eye, and let's get going. The first thing I need to do for my presentation board is to pick out a page size. Now, I typically work in A3 for, weekly kind of work and project stuff, but for my portfolio I chose A2 portrait, and so that's exactly what I'm going to be using for this presentation board as well. You might have slightly different requirements based on the competition you're doing or based on your university's module, so it honestly just depends what you feel comfortable in working in, and of course the orientation of this page too. And the first thing I'm going to be doing is setting out some frame boxes just to kind of get a feel for roughly how many images or renders or sketches I need on the page. And bear in mind, again, this is going to be an A2 page, so I want the images to kind of like jump out and obviously not be too crowded, but also have some kind of variation. Another good thing to keep in mind is your text. Now, a common mistake that I see through many presentation boards is that they will, caption every single image and have, I guess, maybe 2 or 3 sentences for each one. And the problem with this is, as the reader's looking at your page, their eyes are generally going from left to right or up and down, trying to figure out which text is linked to which image. And rather than doing this, it might be better to have the text all in one neat space. And so I've chosen the bottom right-hand corner for this because I feel like there's not really much I want to talk about, but if there was, I would be putting it into here. And this is, again, a very small paragraph. The text size doesn't also need to be quite big. Roughly, for a rule of thumb, I would say anywhere between 10 to 12 points is considered kind of like a readable font size, regardless of the page size. So that's what I usually go for. And then the next thing now I need to do is pick out the images and sketches and things that I need to be using. So while I'm doing all of this, I'm also referring back to the Architecture Competitions Yearbook, and having a look at the kind of arrangement, the variation in whether they have renders or plans. Obviously, in my design project so far, I'm not at that stage where I do have any actual architectural drawings. However, I think for a general theme for this presentation board, I want to kind of showcase the whole journey so far, from this concept of the carpet having different components, and these hybrid components are essentially what makes up this carpet, and then also like including some test visuals that I did recently where the carpet's kind of like floating or flying through this landscape, and I wanted that to be quite a powerful image. So that's what I've kind of started to include. Again, this takes a bit of trial and error, But you also have to think about which images work with each other. And of course, you want to have a variation. You want to have like different skill sets on show in a presentation board typically. But it is really important to also tell a story throughout. Now, the great thing about the presentation boards in the Architecture Competitions Yearbook is that they're also accompanied by actual work, so you can also see them at a closer level. Whereas a typical presentation board might be up for a crit or might be within the portfolio, and so you really have to think about realistically how many images you can include. So here I started choosing a render I did earlier, and then I thought it might be good to include some of the recent drawings that I've done that are at a very smaller scale, and I wasn't sure whether to put them together as kind of like a mixed trio, but it wasn't quite working because I think the render was just too small proportion wise, and so instead I kind of made the decision to change up the format a little bit, which you'll see later on. Another thing that is good to look out for is naming your layers. Obviously, most of the images and things that I've imported in have already come from Photoshop, so they already have readable names and things, and they're all labeled accurately. But if you're kind of mixing and matching and editing things within this Photoshop file, it is probably a good idea to label your layers and keep them organized. I basically ended up putting together the frame boxes into a separate group and then locking those just so I could play around with the images as well. And then here you'll see that I've basically made this bird's eye view render kind of like the main feature image on this page, and I've made that full bleed so that there are no white borders around the edges. I think this again gives it a more kind of like strong presence within the page, and then I was again thinking about whether different orientations for some of the images might work, or whether I can kind of like add stuff. But honestly, the whole point of a presentation board is not to overcrowd things, so you have to kind of make sure that you're not putting everything in for the sake of showing everything. Again, it's about kind of like refining that narrative, and so although I've got that first initial render, I also wanted to include a perspective render as well, because that has a little more like textural qualities coming through. And then you can kind of see the entire carpet from, again, a bird's eye plan view on its own, which was essentially a rendered collage. And the other three images are, again, supporting images. They're drawings, so that kind of shows another skill that I'm working on, and a render too. So as you can see, I've kind of moved the text around just a little bit just to kind of like break up some of the images too, and so it's not quite as repetitive. Another thing to think about might be the overall kind of like color within the page. You can see this one's quite warm. It has good warm tones, yellows, greens, oranges, that kind of thing. So I don't really need to edit much of it, which is great. And after I've just placed these two drawings, I'm just going to slightly adjust. And another thing that I would say look out for is the space between your images and your text. Make sure everything's quite even, because I think from far away, if you step back, it can look very off very quickly. And so even like the white border around the edge towards the bottom of the page, make sure that's kind of like roughly even to the spaces in between the images and so on and so forth. If you do choose to like crop some of the images, that's totally fine as well. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly how you've done it. This is your chance to kind of modify things and play around with the composition, play around with the images. You can also, however much time you have, go in, make these smart objects and edit them further. And now I'm just kind of placing this final collage. Again, I think this render doesn't quite work just because it's got those large white spaces either side of it. And since I've already included a render and they're already within the different landscape views as well, I decided to try something else and include an earlier kind of like photoshopped sketch plan instead. So you'll see me dropping that in a second. But yeah, I think the great thing about the Architecture Competitions Yearbook is that there's so many different things that you can take away, whether it's from how they've laid out the text or what kind of images they've used. Is it all renders? Is it all plans? What is the kind of like sequence of diagrams on a page? And this will really help you to kind of like refine your work, but also identify good compositions versus bad compositions. Because I think that's a really key skill that not many architecture students realize early on. And so now I've finished adding this sketch. I think it's looking quite okay to me. Another final thing that I like to do is to just kind of like go in and make everything a tiny bit smaller, just so that there is a lot more white space around things and it doesn't feel as compact. And then another last thing would be, I guess, to adjust any colors. So here I'm using the levels, hue, saturation, brightness and contrast, all the adjustment layers to kind of make everything look a bit more seamless. And again, this is a good kind of tip to have is in your portfolio, make sure there is an ongoing theme, whether it's, even if you're using one color, it still makes a lot of difference because you can kind of see that you've taken the time to incorporate this theme throughout and make everything look like it's part of the same project. So all these tweaks can be done in Photoshop, obviously. And I guess the final thing I would say is really that with your presentation boards, you really want to experiment as much as you can, but also make sure that you're kind of, I guess, being aware of what you're showing and what your strong suits are, but don't kind of like disregard all of the work that you've done, even if it's the work that's kind of in progress or didn't really work out as an idea. I think it's still really important to show that kind of work because it can kind of like show that you're willing to test out different things and experiment and iterate and so on. So the final step now I'm doing is just adding in the title of my project. Of course, you don't have to do this, and you can add in or include all kinds of captions along the page. So it's totally up to you at the end of the day. This is just what I thought might look best. And I think that's all for now. But if you've stayed till this part of the video, I would highly recommend you check the description for the giveaway. It's going to be happening on Instagram, and I've partnered up with Architecture Competitions Yearbook to give away one free copy of last year's yearbook, and I'll be telling you a bit more details about this soon. So I've partnered with Architecture Competitions Yearbook to give away a free copy of this yearbook to architecture students and graduates who are looking for inspiration. And if you want to enter the giveaway, just follow the details below in the description, or you can head over to my Instagram and enter the giveaway there too.